I didn't say a word when my phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee, watching the fog sit low over the backyard the way it does in October, and I saw my granddaughter's name on the screen. She never calls that early. She texts. She's 29 years old, and she texts like every other person her age. Little bursts of words, sometimes just a picture of something she thought I'd like. A flower she passed on her walk. A stray cat on a windowsill. That's how she talks to me. So when I saw her calling, I already knew. I picked up and I didn't say hello. I just said, "Where are you?" She told me she was at the airport. Not inside, outside, on the curb. The arrivals and departures curb where people stand with their bags waiting for rides. She said she'd been there for 2 hours. She had her 2 children with her. My great-grandchildren. Petra was 4. Little Eli had just turned 2. I didn't know where else to go, she said. And her voice was the voice of someone who has been crying so long they've moved past the crying part and into something quieter and worse. I told her to stay right where she was. I told her I was coming. I didn't ask questions. Not then. I poured the rest of my coffee down the drain, picked up my keys, and drove. Her name is Thea, my granddaughter. She is my late daughter's only child, which means she is also the closest thing I have left to my daughter. And I am not ashamed to say that when I pulled up to that curb and saw her sitting on top of a duffel bag with Petra pressed against her side and Eli asleep across her lap, my throat closed so tight I had to sit in the car for a moment before I could get out. She had 4 bags. I counted them from the car. 4 bags and 2 small children and no coat, even though it was cold. I got out. I walked to her. I didn't hug her right away. I crouched down to Petra's level first, because that's what you do with a 4-year-old who is clearly frightened and trying very hard to be brave. I told her she had the most impressive ponytail I'd ever seen. It wasn't even a ponytail. It was barely a knot. But Petra straightened up a little and said her daddy did it, and I said he did a wonderful job. Then I stood up and I looked at my granddaughter. She had a bruise under her left eye. Not from a punch. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about that kind of husband. It was from exhaustion, from not sleeping, from the particular violence of a life falling apart in slow motion, and then all at once, I said, "Get in the car." She started to cry again. I put my hand on her face. I said, "We'll talk at the house. Get in the car." Her husband's name is Caspian. That's not a name I would have chosen to trust from the start. But Thea loved him, and he was kind enough when things were easy. And for a while, things were easy. He'd grown up wealthy. Not old money, but new money that had been around long enough to start pretending it was old. His mother's name was Vivica. She ran a commercial real estate firm that her father had built and that she had spent 40 years expanding until it occupied 6 floors of a building downtown and managed properties in 4 states. I knew Vivica. Not well. We'd been at dinners together, family holidays, one very long Easter brunch where she spoke about herself in the third person twice, and I spent the afternoon pretending to need more tea so I could escape to the kitchen. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel slightly smaller. Not because she was loud. She wasn't loud. She was precise. She chose what she said and what she didn't say with the same calculation she used for everything else. And if you didn't know her well, you might mistake that precision for grace. I knew better. I just kept it to myself because Thea was happy. Thea had been working at the firm for 3 years. Vivica had offered her a position in client relations after the wedding, and Thea had taken it because she thought it was a gesture of goodwill, an olive branch, an invitation into the family. I thought it was a leash, but I kept that to myself too. What happened? Thea told me once we were back at my house and the children were settled in the guest room with cartoons and crackers. What happened started small and then didn't. There was money missing from a client account. Not a small amount. $43,000 moved in 3 transfers over 6 weeks. each one flagged internally but not reported to anyone outside the firm. When the client finally noticed and called directly, Viveka's office launched an internal audit. The audit pointed to Thea. The access logs showed her credentials. The transfer authorizations had her electronic signature. The internal correspondence, emails sent from her account, referenced the transactions in language that, read cold, sounded like someone covering their tracks. Thea told me she hadn't done any of it. She said she'd never seen those emails. She said her login had been used on days she wasn't even in the office. Once when she was homesick, once when she was at Petra's pediatric appointment, once when she was at her own mother's gravesite on the anniversary of her death. She had documentation for 2 of those days. The third one, the grave, she had nothing except my word that she'd been there, because I had been there with her. Her mother-in-law presented the evidence to Caspian privately, before anyone else was told. She sat her son down in her office and she showed him everything. The logs, the emails, the transaction records, and she told him what she believed, or what she said she believed, which was that his wife had been stealing from the firm. Caspian came home that night and told Thea he thought she should stay with a friend for a while things got sorted out. While he figured out how to think about all of this, she had nowhere to go. Her mother is gone. Her father has been out of the picture since she was 7. Her friends are the friends she made through Caspian, through the firm, through the social world his mother controlled. She called me. I made her eat something before I let her talk for very long. She hadn't eaten. The children had crackers she'd been carrying in a bag, and she'd given them most of what she had with her and not thought about herself at all, which is exactly the kind of person she is and exactly the kind of person Viveka had calculated she would be too grateful and too isolated to push back. While Thea slept, she was asleep before noon. In my bed, with Eli tucked against her back and Petra lying so straight and still beside her that it broke my heart. I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought, I am 67 years old. I've been in commercial real estate my entire adult life. Not the glamorous side of it, not the ribbon cuttings and the charity galas and the development announcements. The other side. The side where you read contracts. The side where you read contracts. The side where you learn, over the course of 4 decades, exactly who owns what and how. Viveka's firm was called Aldridge Voss Properties. Her father had founded it as Aldridge Properties in 1971. When he died, he left it to Viveka and restructured the holding company under a trust that had been managed for the last 11 years by a financial services group based in Atlanta. That financial services group was called Meridian Continental Holdings. I know Meridian Continental Holdings because I have held a 40% stake in it since 2009. I am not going to pretend I had forgotten this. I hadn't forgotten it. I had simply never had occasion to think about it in terms of Viveka, because why would I? She and I occupied separate worlds. Her son had married my granddaughter and we smiled at each other over holiday tables, and that was the extent of our relationship. But I had not forgotten. I did not call anyone that day. I didn't call the managing partners at Meridian. I didn't call my attorney, though I would eventually. I sat with my coffee, a new cup, since I poured the first one out at 6 in the morning, and I looked at the backyard and I thought about my daughter. Her name was June. She died when Thea was 22, which meant Thea had been out in the world without her mother for 7 years now. 7 years of figuring things out alone. 7 years of trying to build something, a marriage, a family, a place, without the one person who should have been there to tell her when something was wrong. I had tried to be that person. I had tried to be careful about it, not to overstep, not to insert myself where I wasn't wanted. I am a grandmother. I hold my opinions lightly, or I try to. I bite my tongue more than anyone who knows me would probably believe. But I had sat at my kitchen table the morning after Viveka offered Thea that job at the firm, and I had thought, this is a leash. And I had said nothing, because Thea was happy. I wouldn't say nothing anymore. There is a board meeting for Meridian Continental every quarter. The next one was 11 days away. I didn't need the board meeting. But it gave me a timeline, and I find I work better with timelines. I spent those 11 days making calls. Not to Viveka, not to Caspian, to people who had known me for decades, people who understood the architecture of these things. My attorney, who is a small woman from Tennessee, who has never once raised her voice and has never once lost a negotiation I know of. The lead partner at Meridian, who had worked with me since the company was restructured and who owed me, in the particular unspoken accounting of professional relationships, more than one favor. I asked for documentation. I asked for the ownership records for Aldridge Voss, the trust instruments, the chain of title going back to Viveka's father. I asked for the internal management reports Meridian received quarterly from the firm. And then I asked for something specific. I asked whether the internal audit Viveka had conducted, the one that produced the evidence against Thea, had been shared with Meridian as the trust's managing agent, as it was required to be under the terms of the trust agreement in the event of any finding of employee misconduct involving sums over $10,000. It had not been shared. That was a breach. Not a small one. I also made another call to a man I'd worked with years ago who specialized in digital forensics. The kind of work nobody talks about at dinner parties, but that has become, in the last 20 years, the most important work there is in disputes like this one. I told him what Thea had told me. The dates, the transactions, the emails, the access logs. I told him what I needed. He came back to me in 4 days. The access log showed Thea's credentials, yes. But credentials can be borrowed. The IP addresses associated with 2 of the 3 logins were not the IP address of Thea's computer or her phone or any device registered to her account. One of them matched a device registered to the firm's IT administrator. The other matched an IP address that had been used before, in a different internal access log, on a day when Thea was documented as being off-site. The emails had been sent from her account, but the metadata, the actual origin data embedded in the files, showed they had been composed on a device she had never used, a desktop computer that sat in an office on the 5th floor of the Aldridge Voss building. Viveka's personal office is on the 5th floor. I went to see Caspian before I went anywhere else. That surprised him. He opened the door of the house. The house Thea had been living in for 5 years. The house where my great-grandchildren had been born, where I had sat at the kitchen table for birthday breakfasts and Sunday dinners, and he looked at me the way people look when they're expecting something they deserve. I did not give him what he was expecting. I asked him if I could sit down. He said yes. I sat in the living room where Thea's books were still on the shelf and Petra's artwork was still taped to the wall beside the window. 6 paper sunflowers, each one slightly larger than the last because Petra had been on a sunflower phase in August. And I looked at my grandson-in-law and I said, quietly, I need you to listen to me. He listened. I told him what the forensic analysis had found. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't accuse his mother of anything in those words. I simply laid out what the data showed and let him understand what it meant. I told him about the IP addresses. I told him about the desktop computer on the 5th floor. I told him about the metadata. I told him that I had documentation of all of it and that my attorney had copies. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Why would she do that?" And I said, because she wanted Thea gone and she didn't know another way to do it. He shook his head. Not disagreement, more like a man trying to shake water from his ears, trying to clear something. I said, your mother made a mistake, Caspian. She made a very serious mistake, and she made it in a way that left a record. I need you to understand what happens next depends on how the next few days go. He asked what I meant. What I meant was this. I had a meeting scheduled with the managing partners at Meridian Continental in 9 days. On the agenda, among other things, was a review of the trust management protocols for Aldridge Voss properties, following the discovery of an unreported internal audit that constituted a breach of the trust agreement. If that breach was confirmed, and it would be confirmed because I had the documentation, Meridian had the authority, under the trust instruments, to appoint an independent administrator to oversee the firm's operations for a period of no less than 12 months. during which time all personnel decisions required outside approval. That meant Viveka could not fire anyone, could not hire anyone, could not make any unilateral decisions about the firm she had spent 40 years building. It also meant the audit findings, the ones that pointed to Thea, would be reviewed by an outside party, with the forensic analysis I had commissioned sitting right alongside them. I didn't want to do any of this in a way that destroyed the firm. It employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with what Viveka had done. I didn't want to do it in a way that put Caspian in a position he couldn't recover from. He was, at bottom, a man who had believed his mother because she was his mother, and I understood that even if I couldn't excuse it. What I wanted was very specific. I told Caspian what I wanted. I wanted Thea reinstated with a formal, documented withdrawal of all findings against her. I wanted the forensic report entered into the firm's records. I wanted a written acknowledgement from the firm, not from Viveka personally, because I didn't need her to say she was sorry. I needed a document that the audit had been conducted in error and that Thea bore no responsibility for the missing funds. I wanted to know where the $43,000 actually went. I had my suspicions. The forensic analyst had thoughts. We would be sharing those thoughts with the appropriate people. And I wanted Thea's future employment to be entirely her choice. If she wanted to go back to the firm, she could go back with her name clean. If she never wanted to set foot in that building again, she didn't have to. Caspian sat with all of that for a long time. Finally, he said, "And if my mother doesn't agree?" I said, "Then the meeting at Meridian happens as scheduled, and the independent administrator comes in, and the forensic report becomes part of a very different kind of proceeding." I stood up to leave. I looked at Petra's sunflowers on the wall for a moment, then I looked at him. I said, "She's the only grandchild I have left. You need to understand what that means to me." I left him sitting in that house. Viveka called me the following morning. It was the first time she had ever called me directly. We had always communicated through the buffer of family. Messages passed through Caspian, logistics arranged by Thea. Hearing her voice on my phone was strange. It was very controlled. She said she'd been informed that I had certain interests in Meridian Continental. I said that was accurate. She said she was surprised she hadn't known about that before. I said there had been no reason for her to know. There was a silence. I let it sit. She said, "What do you want exactly?" I told her. Everything I had told Caspian, plainly and without embellishment. Another silence. "The missing money," she said, carefully. "The 43,000. I said, "Yes." She said it had been a bookkeeping reclassification, an internal reallocation. She said it could be explained. I said, "I'm sure it can. I'd like the explanation provided to Meridian's partners along with everything else." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. It was the sound, I thought, of someone recalibrating, of someone who had spent 40 years being the most powerful person in every room she entered and had just realized she was not, in this particular conversation, that person. She said she would be in touch through her attorney. I said that was fine. I hung up. Thea had been at my house for 8 days by then. The children had settled in. Petra had claimed the small armchair in the living room as her personal territory and could be found there most mornings, arranging and rearranging a collection of river stones she'd discovered in my garden. Ellie had become attached to a crocheted blanket I'd made years ago that had been sitting in the linen closet, and he carried it everywhere, including to breakfast, where it trailed through his cereal. I hadn't told Thea everything. Not yet. I'd told her that I was looking into some things. I'd told her to rest. She pushed back on that at first. She wanted to do something, fix something, make calls, fight. I understood that, but I told her that sometimes the most useful thing you can do in the middle of a crisis is be fully present for your children, and that was not a nothing thing, and she needed to let me handle this part. She trusted me. That was the thing that sat heaviest with me through all of it. That she trusted me completely, the way you trust someone when they are the last person you have. I felt the weight of that every day. On the 9th morning, I made us both coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her what had happened. All of it. The forensics. The trust breach. The conversation with Caspian. The call from the Veka. She didn't say anything for a very long time. Then she said, "You've been holding all of this for 9 days." I said, "Yes." She said, "By yourself." I said, "My attorney knew." She looked at her coffee. She looked out the window at the garden where Petra was crouching over the river stones in the morning light, moving them with great seriousness. She said, "I didn't know you had anything to do with that company." I said, "There was no reason for you to know." She said, "Grandma." I said, "I know." The formal documentation from Aldridge Voss came through 12 days later, a letter on firm letterhead, co-signed by Vivica and the firm's general counsel, stating that the internal audit findings regarding Thea had been reviewed in light of new forensic evidence and were withdrawn in full, that Thea's employment record was cleared, that she was welcome to return to her position. She didn't return. She didn't want to. What she wanted, she told me, was to go back to school. She'd started a graduate program in environmental policy the year before she'd married Caspian, and she'd stopped when Petra came. She wanted to finish. I told her she should. She and the children stayed with me for 2 more months while she figured out the next pieces. She and Caspian had a great deal to figure out. That was between them, and I stayed out of it, which was perhaps the hardest thing I did through any of this. He came to see the children. He came once, alone, and sat in my kitchen and didn't say very much. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and wasn't sure yet which pieces went back and which ones needed to be left out. I made him coffee. I didn't say anything unkind. He was the father of my great-grandchildren. That was what it was. The question of the $43,000 was handled separately, through Meridian's oversight process, and I was not directly involved in how it resolved. I have my assumptions about where it had been going and why, and I expect I'm right. But that was no longer my primary concern. My primary concern had been accomplished. The week before Thea moved into her own apartment, a small one, 2 bedrooms in a neighborhood she'd always liked, close to the university. She came and found me in the garden. I was doing exactly what I do every morning in October, pulling the dead annuals from the beds before the ground gets too hard. It's not glamorous work. It's cold, and my knees are not what they were. She sat on the bench by the back fence and watched me for a while. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Did you know, when all of this was happening, when she was building the case against me, did you know you had that card to play?" I pulled a dried stem from the soil and set it in the wheelbarrow. I said I knew what I had. I didn't know I'd ever need to use it. She was quiet. I said, "That's not entirely true. I think I always knew, somewhere, that the situation wasn't right. I knew she had too much of your life in her hands. I just kept hoping it wouldn't matter." Thea said, "I should have listened to you." I said, "You were happy. That's not a mistake." She said, "You never told me that you were worried." I said, "No, I didn't." The fog was still sitting in the low part of the yard, the way it does in October. Petra was inside with her stones. Eli was asleep. I said, "I should have. That's something I carry." Thea came and knelt beside me in the dirt. She is 29 years old, and she was wearing her good coat, and she knelt right down in the garden bed and started pulling dead stems with me without being asked. We worked like that for a while without talking. She has been in her apartment for 4 months now. The children go to a good school 2 blocks away. She is enrolled for the spring semester. She calls me on Tuesday mornings. Not always, sometimes it's a text, sometimes just a picture. A flower she passed on her walk. A stray cat on a windowsill. Once, a picture of Petra's river stones arranged on the apartment windowsill in the afternoon light, each one placed with obvious seriousness. I save every one of them. The Aldridge Voss firm is still operating. The Veka is still there as far as I know. The independent administrator came and went. What changed internally I couldn't say with any precision. What I do know is that certain processes are now subject to outside review, and that certain decisions require approval that didn't require it before. That is enough. I think sometimes about the morning Thea called me from that curb, how I'd poured my coffee out and picked up my keys and driven to her without asking a single question. I think about the way I'd crouched down to Petra's level and said something silly about her hair and the way the little girl had straightened up just slightly. I'm 67 years old. My knees ache in October. I have a garden that I tend badly and love completely. I did not set out to be someone who holds a card like that. You accumulate things over 40 years of work, knowledge, relationships, small pieces of paper that represent larger things. Most of the time, none of it matters beyond its own purpose. Sometimes it does. I didn't win anything. That's not what this was. What this was my granddaughter calling me from a curb with her children and her bags in the cold, and me being exactly who I needed to be at that exact moment. That is the only thing I would have wanted. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually means to be ready for something. Not prepared in the obvious way, not the way you prepare for a trip or a meeting or a hard conversation you know is coming. I mean the other kind of ready. The kind that builds quietly over decades without your realizing it, through every decision you made and everything you learned and every moment you chose to pay attention when it would have been easier not to. That kind of ready doesn't announce itself. It just sits there patient until the morning your phone rings at 6:47 and suddenly everything you've accumulated over a lifetime has a purpose you never anticipated. I am 67 years old. I have spent 40 years in an industry that most people find boring. Contracts, ownership records, trust instruments, the architecture of who holds what and why. I didn't do any of it thinking I was building towards something. I did it because it was the work in front of me and I believed in doing work carefully. That's all. There was no grand design. But here is what I've come to understand. The way you conduct yourself every day, over years and years, quietly shapes what you're capable of when it actually matters. The Vecca spent 40 years building power through control. Controlling information, controlling people, controlling what others were allowed to know. And when she felt threatened by Thea, that's the only tool she reached for, because it was the only one she'd ever sharpened. She didn't consider that someone else in the room might have spent 40 years building something different, something quieter, something she couldn't see. That's the thing about integrity as a practice, not as a performance, not as something you announce, but as the actual daily habit of doing things the right way when no one is watching. It compounds. Every honest transaction, every careful decision, every relationship you tend without agenda, it accumulates into something real. Viveka couldn't have known what I held, because the kind of person who builds what she built never thinks to look for that kind of power in anyone else. She was looking for a fight. I had never been interested in fighting. What I did for Theo wasn't dramatic. I made calls. I read documents. I asked the right questions of the right people. I moved carefully and I moved with a clear purpose. Not revenge, not to prove anything, but to correct something that was wrong. That distinction mattered to me. It still does. There's a difference between using what you have to hurt someone and using what you have to protect someone and using what you have to protect someone. I knew which one I was doing, and that knowledge kept me steady through all of it. I think about Thea's daughter, Petra, arranging her river stones on the windowsill of the new apartment. 4 years old, completely serious, completely absorbed. She doesn't know what happened. She just knows she has a home now and her grandmother visits on Sundays. That's enough for her, and it should be, but someday she'll be old enough to understand that the people who love you don't always show it loudly. Sometimes they show it by spending 40 years becoming exactly the person you'll need them to be, long before either of you knew you'd need it. I didn't win anything. I just showed up, and I had something to show up with because of how I'd spent my time. That's the only wisdom I have to offer. Be the kind of person, quietly, every day, who could help someone if they needed it. You won't know when it will matter, but it will matter.